and I'd first ask unanimous consent that the majority report be placed in the record, since it is exactly the opposite, no surprise, of the minority report. Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Secretary, in this town, everyone's entitled to an opinion, but not facts. Why can you name one reason that in Alaska, the Federal Treasury has received $2.2 billion in Federal lease money during your administration, and additionally, another $1 billion has been invested by the oil companies in exploration, and yet they have gotten nothing back, in no small part because Shell and others have been delayed in actually receiving the permit? So aren't you willing to take at least some responsibility for the fact that a lease is not a permit? And when you call it idle, are you really saying it's idle? And this is the real question. Are they idle, or are they not yet producing? Would you please explain yourself on your figures? Isn't it true your figures are, when you say idle, not yet producing, and it can well mean that money is being invested?
The term, as described in the report that was provided to the President and that I am sure your staff has available, made it clear that by idle it means that there is no active exploration or production occurring.
Does that mean there's no permit request or environmental impact being done?
There may be some activity, but there is no exploration activity.
So again, a lease costing $2.2 billion in Alaska, the stockholders would sue and win if it was not in the best interest of the company to do everything they could to get a return on their $2.2 billion. Isn't it true?
I can't speak to a shareholder's rights. I do know that we are working with Shell very closely to address their interests, and we have just in the last month received exploration plans that we are processing for the potential exploration of those permits next summer.
Right, which is 1 year later than it would have been if it had been processed in a timely fashion. There's a belief that in fact prices are artificially high because of speculators. I'm not going to debunk that. I'm going to ask you a simple question. If we got all of the resources of oil and natural gas from both Federal and private lands that are estimated to be available, isn't it true that we could be energy self-sufficient for 100 years? Isn't that what all the studies show? I'm not saying that it's an easy goal, but with fracking and other technology, isn't it true we could raise at least 40%, which would put us marginally within self-sufficiency? If you include Canada, it would make us self-sufficient. Yes or no, isn't that true?
I don't know if you are referring to technically recoverable resources or economically recoverable resources, Mr.
Well, at $100 a barrel, isn't it more than enough to be economically recoverable, not just technically recoverable?
I really don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. Well, if you would answer for the record, I would appreciate it.
Certainly will.
For the Administrator, I've just got a very simple question, and both sides will have other questions that probably will be more thoughtful in some ways. But in your opening statement, you talked about the requirement to make sure that these drilling rigs that were, quote, as much pollution as a refinery. Isn't it true that when China is drilling just south of our border in Cuban waters, isn't it true that they do just as much polluting or more than anybody producing just slightly north of that in U.S. waters? Isn't it true that the global amount of global pollution will actually be higher if it's produced outside the U.S. than if it's produced inside the U.S.? Yes or no?
That's certainly possible. I don't know what emissions come from Chinese rigs. What I can say is that the pollutants—
Oh, yes, you do. You know that we have some of the highest standards of emissions in the world. Isn't that true?
Our standards are high because under the Clean Air Act passed by Congress, we are told to protect the health of Americans, including from pollutants that are not global pollutants. They can be quite local, like SO2, particulate matter, and smog, which can affect everyone from those on a cruise ship in Alaskan waters to recreational and commercial
I appreciate that, but isn't it true that the primary pollutants, especially those that you were talking about earlier, in fact, are global pollutants?
They are certainly emitted globally, sir, but they have local impacts as well.
Last but not least, isn't it true that more oil has been spilled in the Pacific by importation than by actual drilling over the last 30 years?
I don't have the figures, but
I
it's quite
do.
possible.
It has been. I now recognize the ranking member.
Let me make it clear.